Socialism doesn't work, but do you know why? You will when you hear the true story of Thanksgiving that no public school student will ever or has ever heard. That's because it's time for some Straight Talk, Texas. I'm Bunker Bob Steinhagen, and this is a special edition of The Bunker Bob Show. And a very happy Thanksgiving to you and yours, thrill seekers, music lovers, and conversationalists from across the fruited plains of the great state of Texas. I'm your host, Bunker Bob Steinhagen, borrowing my introduction from the greatest talk show host in history, the late, great Rush Limbaugh. For more than 30 years, El Rushbo created the tradition of sharing the true story of Thanksgiving on his radio program, which me and my fellow students of the Limbaugh Institute for Advanced Conservative Studies looked forward to each year. Now that God has taken back this extraordinary man whose talent was, after all, just a loner, the tradition is left to those of us he taught so well. Now, here's the version you were probably taught. The Pilgrims arrived here after an arduous trip across the Atlantic Ocean. They didn't know where they were. They had no idea what to do. They had nothing. The Indians discovered them, took pity, and the Indians saved them. The Indians taught them how to do things they didn't know how to do, like grow food, catch beavers, stuff like that. The Indians saved them, and the Pilgrims thanked them by growing a whole bunch of food and having this big feast. So the story of Thanksgiving that's taught is basically how, without the Native Americans, there wouldn't be a country because the Pilgrims would have died. But at least the Pilgrims were nice enough to pay the Indians back with a big Thanksgiving dinner. However, that's not at all what happened. It's not even close. The point is, the true story of Thanksgiving must be told and shared, or else some might want to rename the holiday Thanksgiving or Indigenous Survivors Day, or as crazy as this sounds. People might end up gathering every Thanksgiving at Plymouth Rock for a national day of mourning. The real story of Thanksgiving, folks, going back to the very first early days of the Pilgrims arriving at Plymouth Rock, is that socialism failed. It is critically important today because we have a Democrat-led country that wants to implement socialism. We're already on our way down the road toward it anyway. So it's crucially important here for people to understand this. The story of Thanksgiving is neither antiquated nor unrelated to the modern social construct of society. It's not a cliche. It's a lesson in history that, for those who do not know it, as Sir Edmund Burke might say, will be doomed to repeat it. When Rush Limbaugh first started his show in the late 80s, if you dared to refer to the Soviet Union as communist, people made fun of you. Ah, come on, Rush, they would say. You see a communist behind every rock. Rush was often ridiculed and berated for identifying communists and communism like Castro or the Chi-Coms. Rush never buckled, but a lot of people did, and like back then, they're doing it now. To even infer that the Democrat Party is on the pathway to socialism is a recipe for open mockery and ridicule by the drive-by media. Come on, you don't believe that. You can't believe that. That's just silly. And they try to mock you and make fun of you, to silence you. But folks, it's real. So let me share with you the true story of Thanksgiving as told by Maharishi. Now, the story of the Pilgrims begins in the early part of the 17th century, the Church of England under King James I was persecuting anyone and everyone who did not recognize the church's absolute civil and spiritual authority, as there was no separation between church and state. Those who challenged ecclesiastical authority and those who believed strongly in freedom of worship were hunted down. Now, this is England in the 1600s. They were hunted down and imprisoned and sometimes executed for their beliefs. That's right. They were executed for their beliefs, to believe something different than the status quo, than those who were in charge, than government. You could end up dead. A group of separatists had the idea that they were going to do something different, and they wanted to separate. They wanted a life of their own. They wanted freedom. Now, a group of separatists, people who didn't want any part of this, first fled to Holland. They liked wooden shoes and cheese and established a community. They were there for 11 years, by the way. After 11 years, about 40 of these separatists who liked wooden shoes and cheese agreed to make a perilous journey to the New World. They had heard about it, some new, exciting place that hadn't been developed. They knew they would face hardships like you and I don't even know, can never even comprehend. And I'm not preaching here. I'm just telling you, we don't know the hardships that people endured. We can't. We are too advanced now. People who lived in the 1600s would not believe life today. I mean, for instance, try to describe jet travel to them back then. They wouldn't understand it. But these people knew they would face hardships, but paramount importance to them was living freely and worshiping God according to the dictates of their own consciences, their own beliefs. That's the freedom they were denied. On August 1st, 1620, the Mayflower set sail. It carried a total of 102 passengers, including 40 of these separatists, the Pilgrims. There were just 40 of them, folks. They were led by William Bradford. On the journey across the Atlantic, and you talk about something that had to be frightening and scary, the Mayflower, by the way, was not much bigger than a 50-foot boat and 102 people on it. On the journey, Bradford set up an agreement, a contract, if you will, that established just and equal laws for all 40 members of the Pilgrim community, irrespective of their religious beliefs. It didn't matter what their religious beliefs were. These are the laws they were all agreeing to live by. Now, where did the revolutionary ideas, these laws come from? We're talking about the Mayflower Compact. That is what Bradford wrote. The Mayflower Compact, derived from the Bible. The Pilgrims were people completely steeped in the lessons of the Old and New Testaments. They were people of deep-seated faith. No matter what else is said about them, and even what is denied, they were devout people of faith. They looked to the ancient Israelites for their example, and because of the biblical precedents set forth in Scripture, they never doubted that their experiment would work. They never doubted that they would get to the New World. They never doubted that once they got there, they would thrive. The journey was long. It was arduous. It was dangerous. And when the Pilgrims finally landed in New England in November, according to William Bradford's detailed journal, they found a cold, barren, desolate wilderness. Imagine New England as it exists today, as nothing but rocks, forest, undeveloped nature in November and getting colder. There were no friends to greet them. There was no shelter of any kind other than hiding under a tree. There was nothing, folks. It was desolate. There were no hotels. There were no inns. There were no places to clean up. There were no houses. I mean, this was real hardship. The sacrifice that they had made for the freedom the freedom to worship was just beginning. During that first winter, remember, they arrived in November. During that first winter, half of them, including William Bradford's own wife, died of starvation, of sickness, exposure to the elements. Now we're getting close to what you were taught in school. When spring finally came, and by the way, writing that doesn't do it justice. Spring didn't just finally come. It was survival. It was an act of survival that you and I cannot possibly relate to or understand. American Special Forces might come closest to understanding it, but military people who have been trained can somewhat understand what the Pilgrims endured. However, even they fall short of full understanding because of the kinds of equipment our military carries with them. You and I can't. We've never done anything like that first winter in the New World. They survived it. Spring finally came. Now, they did meet the Indians, the Native Americans who were there, who did help them in planting corn and fishing for cod. They showed them where the beavers were so the beavers could be skinned for coats, among other things. Now, you animal rights folks are not going to like some of the story, but it happened. But even with this degree of assistance from the Indians, the Native Americans, there wasn't any prosperity yet. They had the Mayflower Compact. They had these laws they were living by, and there was no prosperity. And I wonder why. Now, this is important to understand here, folks, because this is where modern American history lessons end, with the Indians teaching the Pilgrims how to eat, how to fish, how to skin beavers, and all that. That's where it ends. And that's where the feel-good story ends. But that doesn't even get close to the true story. You know, Thanksgiving is actually explained in some textbooks as a holiday for which the Pilgrims gave thanks to the Indians for saving their lives. It wasn't that. That happened, but Thanksgiving was a devout expression of gratitude the Pilgrims gave to God for their survival and everything that was a part of it. Now, here's the part that has been omitted. The original contract the Pilgrims entered into in Holland, they had sponsors. See, they didn't have the money to do this trip on their own. They had sponsors. There were merchant sponsors in London and in Holland, and these merchant sponsors demanded that everything that the Pilgrims produced in the New World would go into a common store, I should say, and a single bank, if you will. And that each member of the Pilgrim community was entitled to one share. Okay, so everybody had an equal share of whatever was in that bank. All of the land they cleared, all of the houses they built belonged to that bank, to the community as well. And they were going to distribute it equally because they were going to be fair. So all of the land that they cleared and all of the houses they built belonged to everybody, belonged to the community, belonged to the bank, belonged to the common store. Nobody owned anything. They just had an equal share in it. It was the true definition of equity. Equality is where everyone starts out at the same place, and equity is when everyone ends up in the same place. It was a commune. The Pilgrims established a commune, essentially. Forerunner of the communes we saw in the 60s and 70s out in California. They even had their own organic vegetables, by the way. Yep, the Pilgrims, forerunners of organic vegetables. Of course, what else could there be? There's no such thing as processed anything back then. William Bradford, who had become the governor of the colony because he was the leader, saw that none of this was working. The Mayflower Compact was not working. Giving everybody a single share of stock in the common store, in the common bank, was not working. The theory of collectivism was not working in practice. It was as costly and destructive to the Pilgrims as it is and has been to anybody who has ever tried it. So, Bradford decided to scrub it. He threw it out and took bold action. He assigned a plot of land to each family. Now, this is the difference between equality and equity. So he was presenting equality to the Pilgrims. Every family could work it, manage it however they wanted to. If they just wanted to sit on it and get fat, dumb, and happy and lazy, they could do it. If they wanted to develop it, if they wanted to grow corn, whatever on it, they could. If they wanted to build on it, they could do that too. If they wanted to turn it into a quasi-business, go right ahead. They could do whatever they wanted to do with it. He turned loose the power of the free enterprise system, a capitalist marketplace. Long before Karl Marx was even born, the Pilgrims had discovered and experimented with what could only be described as socialism, and they found that it didn't work. It failed. Now, it wasn't called that then, but it is exactly as Marx had prescribed it more than 200 years later. To every man according to his need, from every man according to his ability. You know what happened? Nobody did anything. There was no incentive. Nothing worked. Nothing happened. What Bradford and his community found was the most creative and industrious people had no incentive to work any harder than anyone else unless they could utilize the power of personal motivation. There was no prosperity. There was no creativity because there was no incentive. Here's what Bradford wrote about the failure. For this community was found to breed much confusion and discontent. In other words, they were not happy. He wrote, and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. In other words, nobody worked. The way they set it up killed and discouraged work. There was no need. He continued, for young men that were most able and fit for labor and service sat around and did nothing. So that's one of the shocking things. Now, why shouldn't they? Why should they do that? Why should they want to help others if they couldn't help themselves? So they didn't. Bradford summarized it by writing, that was thought injustice to have to work for someone but receive nothing for it. Why should you work for other people when you can't work for yourself? What's the point? Do you hear what he was saying, ladies and gentlemen? The Pilgrims found that people could not be expected to do their best work without incentive. So what did Bradford's community try next? They unharnessed the power of good old free enterprise system by invoking capitalism, the principle of private property, all the way back in the 1600s. It was incredible. Every family was assigned its own plot of land, and they could do with it whatever they wanted to do. This had very good success, wrote Bradford, for it made all hands industrious. So much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. So when profit was introduced, when the opportunity to prosper was introduced, it went gangbusters. That, my friends, is the essence of the true story of Thanksgiving. Now, this is where it gets really good, folks. If you're laboring under the misconception that I was, as I was taught in school. So they set up trading posts and exchanged goods with the Indians after they had enjoyed this prosperity. It was not the Indians that brought them into prosperity. And I highlight this not to insult anybody. The Indians assisted in their arrival, understandably. But what led to prosperity for these original settlers was the common store failed. Socialism didn't work. It's when they introduced capitalism. They didn't have the name for it, but when they turned loose those individual incentives, keep what you produce, sell what you don't need, it went crazy. This is not something they were taught by anybody, but self-experience. It was not the Indians. None of this is said to put anybody down. Don't misunderstand. The Indians did a lot of things that helped them, which I'll get to in just a second, but it was their own industriousness. They set up a trading post. They set up trading posts and exchanged goods with the Indians. They sold stuff to them. And those profits allowed them to pay off their debts to the merchants, their sponsors in London and Holland. And you know what? The success of that colony after they had abandoned socialism and tried it was essentially capitalism, the word spread throughout the old world of this massive amount of prosperity that was there for the taking in the new world. And guess what? Guess what happened? The new world was flooded with new arrivals. Bradford writes, the success and prosperity of the Plymouth settlement attracted more Europeans, which began what became known as the Great Puritan Migration. And all of it, and all it took was prosperity and the word spreading across the Atlantic Ocean of how there was prosperity and it was there for the taking. All you had to do was come. The lesson is, the true story of Thanksgiving is that William Bradford and his pilgrim community were thanking God for the blessing on their community after the first miserable winter of documented failure brought on by their attempt at fairness and equity, which was socialism. It didn't work. Only when they abandoned it did it work. The Native Americans, the indigenous people, the Injuns, whatever you want to call them, they were of considerable assistance, and they were friendly when the pilgrims arrived. But they had little, if anything, to do with the prosperity that occurred. Prosperity was the direct result of Bradford and the Pilgrim leadership deciding to change their structure, the Mayflower Compact. Now, Indians assisted. Naturally, I can't deny it. I mean, they taught them how to fish and survive in a hostile environment, to subsist. And that led them to be productive, undeniably so. But it was the Pilgrim community itself which experienced this massive prosperity, the word of which spread all the way back to the Old World, Europe, across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, as I told you, during the winter of 1620, only 44 out of the original 102 pilgrims survived, including their first elected governor of the colony, John Carver. And it was an Indian named Squanto who came to their rescue. Now, Squanto was no ordinary native. Early settlers in 1610 had captured him and sold him into slavery. A group of Catholic friars freed him and brought him to England, where he learned to speak English. In 1618, serving as an interpreter on an English ship, he was brought back to the New World. It was Squanto, who is a famous Native American in his own right in the Pilgrim story. It was Squanto who taught the Pilgrims how to plant and fish, how to skin beavers. It was Squanto who brokered a peace treaty between the Pilgrims and other Indian tribes. You see, there was more than one tribe of Indians. It was not copacetic. It was not friendly and at one with nature. It was not anything like the multiculturalist would have you believe. There were squabbles, there were power struggles, turf battles. It was human. The Indians, the Pilgrims, everybody was scrambling for power for survival. Survivability was the name of the game, and it was not guaranteed. Now, many of the Pilgrims literally believed that God had sent Squanto to save them, and they believed, the Pilgrims believed, that without Squanto, they never would have survived or thrived. And they experienced a tremendous harvest in 1621, and that's the big gathering that is taught in the history books of the native Indians and the Pilgrims, where they joined together for a huge feast, which is the foundational story of the Thanksgiving story that's taught in public schools, as you probably are aware. But again, that is not the real story of Thanksgiving. That's the textbook brand. It did happen, but it's so much more than that. And that's the true story of Thanksgiving that Rush Limbaugh shared on the most successful radio program in history every Thanksgiving for more than 30 years. And now it's time for former students of the Limbaugh Institute for advanced conservative studies like me to carry forward into the next 30 years. I hope that was insightful, and I hope that you will share this story with others as every Thanksgiving comes, to understand that what's happening in America today is an assault on capitalism, is an assault on freedom and liberty. But remember, we have a choice. We do not have to succumb to the socialism that is pervasive in society today. All we have to do is remember our history, or else we will be doomed to repeat it. Well, I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a blessed Thanksgiving. We have so much to be thankful for. Blessings.